It began with a spark. One small flame flickering in the corner of a barn on an ordinary October night set in motion one of the greatest urban disasters in American history. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, fires were common in Chicago, a city built almost entirely of wood. But what began as a blaze in a neighborhood barn would soon leap across rivers, consume mansions, obliterate businesses, and drive thousands of men, women, and children into the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Within 2 days, Chicago would be unrecognizable, reduced to smoking ruins. And yet, from the ashes of catastrophe, a new city would rise, stronger, prouder, and destined to become one of the great urban centers of the modern world. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is remembered as both a tragedy and a miracle. A tragedy for the destruction it caused, a miracle for the rebirth that followed. But to understand how it happened, why it spread so fast, and what it meant for the United States, we must first step back into Chicago in the years before the fire, when the city was growing faster than any in America, a place of promise and danger at the same time. Chicago in 1871 was barely 40 years old, but it was already home to more than 300,000 people. No other city in the world had grown so quickly. It was a magnet for immigrants, Irish, Germans, Swedes, Poles, Bohemians, all chasing opportunity in the booming Midwest. Farmers sent their grain and livestock into Chicago, where it was processed and shipped eastward. Lumber from Wisconsin and Michigan floated down into the city, stacked high in lumber yards. Railroads converged there, making Chicago the beating heart of America's transportation system. Wealth was rising, fortunes were made daily, and many believed Chicago was destined to rival New York as the capital of commerce. But beneath the glitter of success lay a dangerous truth. Chicago was a wooden city. More than 2/3 of its buildings were constructed from pine boards. Sidewalks were wooden planks. Barns and fences were wood. Even many streets were paved with wooden blocks, laid out neatly, but waiting, like matchsticks, for the touch of fire. Visitors remarked that Chicago seemed less like a city of stone and brick than like a giant lumber yard that just happened to have people living in it. The summer of 1871 had been brutal. Chicago suffered a drought so severe that by October, the entire city was parched. Grass turned yellow, wells ran low, and the wooden houses, barns, and sidewalks dried into perfect fuel. To make matters worse, the fire department was understaffed and exhausted. On October 7th, just one night before the Great Blaze, firefighters had already battled a huge fire that destroyed several blocks on the city's west side. They fought for 17 hours and were left weary, their horses tired, their equipment damaged. No one could have imagined that the next night would bring something far worse. On the evening of October 8, 1871, in a humble neighborhood on Jacobin Street, the first spark appeared. The story that passed into legend was that Catherine O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern while being milked in her barn. Newspapers ran with the tale, and children grew up learning that Chicago had burned because of a careless Irish woman and her mischievous cow. But the truth is more mysterious. Mrs. O'Leary herself denied it, saying she had been in bed when the fire started. Some claimed it was neighborhood boys gambling in the barn. Others pointed to a thief trying to steal milk. The exact cause remains unknown. What is known is that shortly after 9 p.m., flames were spotted in the O'Leary barn, and within minutes, they leapt to nearby sheds and houses. The fire department was alerted, but fate intervened cruelly. A watchman sent the first alarm to the wrong location. Fire engines raced to the wrong neighborhood, while the true blaze spread unchecked. By the time firefighters realized their mistake and reached Jacobin Street, The fire was already raging through block after block. The wind was strong that night, gusting from the southwest, carrying sparks and embers far ahead of the flames. Wooden rooftops caught fire almost instantly. Families rushed into the streets, carrying whatever they could grab: babies, blankets, trunks, and holy books. Many could not carry anything at all. They simply ran for their lives. As midnight approached, the fire grew into a roaring wall of flame. It spread faster than men could run, faster than horses could gallop. Eyewitnesses described houses bursting into flame as if struck by lightning. Great sheets of sparks rained down, igniting blocks that had not yet felt the heat. The sky glowed orange, as though the sun had risen at midnight. The Chicago River was supposed to be a natural barrier, but it failed. Burning debris leapt across the water, landing on lumber yards stacked with thousands of feet of dry pine. They went up like volcanoes. Soon, the river itself seemed to burn, as oil, tar, and grease floating on the water caught fire. People trying to cross bridges to safety found the bridges aflame. They were trapped, forced to choose between the fire behind them and the river in front of them. By dawn on October 9th, the firestorm had reached the city's downtown. Banks, hotels, grand theaters, and office buildings crumbled in the heat. The courthouse, crowned by a great dome, collapsed in a thunderous crash. Even the waterworks, Chicago's lifeline, was destroyed, leaving firefighters with no water pressure to fight the flames. The fire now had free rein. Panic seized the city. Tens of thousands of residents fled northward, carrying what little they could. Some rode wagons piled with furniture, others herded livestock, while many simply walked, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes blinded by smoke. Parents carried children in their arms, children clutched pets or small treasures. People covered their mouths with cloth, but the air was so thick with ash that many could barely breathe. Women fainted in the streets, men collapsed from exhaustion, and still the fire came on. By the afternoon of October 9th, the firestorm had consumed Chicago's business district and roared into the north side, where many of the city's wealthiest citizens lived. Mansions went up in flames just as quickly as shanties. Churches, schools, libraries, all burned without mercy. In Lincoln Park, desperate families huddled together, praying the open ground would keep them safe. Others fled to the shore of Lake Michigan, where thousands waded into the cold water, standing waist-deep for hours while fires swept past them on land. One witness described the scene. The whole city seemed to be one vast sheet of flame, the heavens one canopy of fire. The roar was like that of a hurricane, mingled with the crash of falling buildings and the shrieks of terrified people. For 30 hours, the fire raged. It was not until late on October 10th, when a rainstorm finally swept in, that the flames died out. When the smoke cleared, Chicago lay in ruins. More than 17,000 buildings were destroyed. Over 100,000 people, nearly a third of the city's population, were left homeless. The official death toll was listed as around 300, but many historians believe the true number was much higher, as countless bodies were incinerated or lost in the rubble. The scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Streets vanished beneath piles of ash and twisted iron. Trees stood blackened like skeletons. The once proud downtown was a wasteland of rubble. And yet, amid the devastation, stories of survival and heroism shone through. Firefighters who fought until their arms gave out, priests who carried the elderly to safety, mothers who shielded their children with their own bodies. Chicagoans showed extraordinary courage in the face of disaster. In the days after the fire, the city was transformed into a refugee camp. Tens of thousands slept in makeshift shelters in parks and along the lakefront. Relief poured in from across the United States and even from overseas. New York sent trainloads of supplies, London held fundraising concerts, and ordinary Americans mailed money, food, and clothing. It was one of the first moments in American history when a disaster in one city drew national compassion and aid. But perhaps the most astonishing part of the Great Chicago Fire was not the destruction, it was the recovery. Instead of giving up, Chicago chose to rebuild. Within days, workmen were clearing rubble, merchants set up shops and tents, architects and planners saw an opportunity to create not just a new Chicago, but a better one. In the decades that followed, Chicago would reinvent itself, building with steel and stone instead of wood, pioneering the world's first skyscrapers, and emerging as a city of modern architecture. The fire, which had seemed like a curse, became the spark that transformed Chicago into a model for the future. The legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow endured for more than a century, a symbol of how small accidents can lead to great catastrophes. In truth, the fire was not the fault of one woman or one animal. It was the result of a city unprepared for disaster, built of the wrong materials, struck by drought and bad luck. But Americans love stories with morals, and the cow became an easy explanation. Only in 1997 did the Chicago City Council officially exonerate Catherine O'Leary, declaring her innocent of blame. Today, the Great Chicago Fire is remembered not only as one of the greatest disasters in American history, but also as a turning point. It revealed the fragility of a booming industrial city, but also the resilience of its people. Out of the ashes rose a new Chicago, bigger, stronger, and more determined than ever. And so the fire that once seemed like the end became, in truth, a beginning. When Americans remember the Great Chicago Fire, they do not only remember the flames, they remember the courage of those who survived, the generosity of those who gave, and the rebirth of a city that refused to die. Chicago, the city of fire, became the city of steel, the city of skyscrapers, and the city of dreams. And it all began with a single spark in a humble wooden barn on a quiet October night.